Okay, today we're going to talk about creating a Material Design Lite login component using Vue.js. We are going to basically create the same type of login component as we did with the Bootstrap 3 version in a previous tutorial. In this particular case, this is going to carry the Material Design, design, as opposed to the Bootstrap design. In this tutorial, basically, we're going to want to install the Webpack Vue-CLI project. We're going to update its core files because one of the things I've noticed is that the core files are starting to get a little bit out of date, at least with the current files. So as long as we don't mess with the build pack files, such as Webpack and the loaders and things of that nature, then we shouldn't have any problem with the build system that the CLI builds for us. Really, all we should want to do is just update Vue.js, update the router if you're using the router, and in this case we will be. And of course, if you're using Vuex, you'd be installing that separately, so it wouldn't matter anyway. We're going to show how to install the Material Design Lite as far as just bringing it in as script. We're going to clean the hello.vue file out so that we can use it as our primary parent component to our login component. We're going to create the login component. We'll scaffold out the login component using Material Design Lite so that it looks the way we want it to look, but we'll still not have any functionality. Then we'll cover validation tools and how the Material Design Lite framework actually deals with validation, and talk about a gotcha using the required attribute in the input elements that actually causes an unwanted look from the component, and how we're going to work around that. Obviously, we're going to then move on to adding props and methods to make the functionality work, and then we will create the login feedback that loops back from the parent so that we emulate basically if the information had gone off to some alternate source, whether it be a database or Firebase or some API, to check the credentials, and then we'll fire back a false to show what the user would receive if in fact the credentials failed. So without further ado, let's get on with it and start building something. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're going to build here real quick. We've got our login component, which is actually a child component of the hello.vue now. As I said, we'll clean out the hello.vue and add the login component to it as a child. We end up with this material design style login with an email address, a password, the remember me function, and then it'll give us some feedback if in fact it doesn't log in correctly. But as you can see, it's going to give us the standard email input, which will give us kind of instant feedback on whether it's correct or not, just like our Bootstrap version. So you can see that as we type, it's going to give us the feedback. All right, and then our password works just like the Bootstrap version. If we don't put in the required given credentials, then the password will indicate that it doesn't have the required credentials. In this case, a minimum of 4, maximum of 10. We've got the remember me, which will set a cookie to remember the username and password. And then we've got the sign in, which becomes disabled at any point that these do not meet criteria. So there's no need to do a round robin on the server if the criteria is already failing. So the sign in button obviously becomes useful only when the email address is valid. So we can see that the sign in actually becomes disabled. If we select Remember Me, then we will save the cookies. And all of this is indicated over here on the console. Then we show that the server returned a bad email password. Of course, this is all dummy information being sent back and forth because all we want to do is create the component. We're not interested in the back end at this point. And maybe, you guys can give me some hints or something and make that look a little better than just a little red text. Certainly make it the same color red as our indigo, which I should do anyway. But if we have the Remember Me set now and I refresh the page, wiping out all data, you'll see that we looked for the cookie over here, grabbed the cookie, it kept the email and password on the computer, and the Remember Me button becomes unchecked. We do that for security reasons. You can obviously set that in the cookie to remember how that was set if that's what you want the functionality to be. And then if we sign in with that unchecked, we delete the cookie, as you can see here. And if we refresh, the email address and password no longer are available to the cookie. And we'll show how to build all of that, also showing our sign-in, that our button changes during our sign-in event to loading. So it does indicate to the user that something's happening. And in this particular case, I've got a timeout set for 4 seconds to indicate a really slow server. But let's go ahead and get to the coding and setting up the CLI and Vue.js and start building it from scratch. I'm going to go ahead and start with WebStorm, but you can use your editor of choice because WebStorm for me automatically has a terminal in it. If you need to see how to install the Vue CLI and the project via terminal, I have a complete tutorial on that, so just check that out. I'll put that in a badge or something on the video. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a project. If you're using an IDE, Integrated Development Environment, that is project-based, then you're going to need to create a project. If you're not using a project-based IDE, then you don't have to worry about that. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and install the Vue CLI if you haven't. So you're just going to npm install Vue CLI and globally. Since I install this almost every single time, probably don't have to set it for global, but I do. It doesn't hurt anything. If you're curious, the global allows you to use it in other projects outside of this particular source. And currently I'm at version 2.8.2. We're going to show you why we want to update some of those core components in there. But let's go ahead and use it real quick. So we'll do Vue init Webpack. Webpack's the template. There are many templates. You can look on the Vue-CLI instructions to see what the differences are. And then you would put a package name here, whatever package name you want, if in fact you're using a non-project based IDE. I'm using a project-based IDE, so I already have my parent folder, and I don't want it to create one for me. So I'm just going to leave that blank. And then it'll ask me, do I want to generate the project in the current directory? If I had put a folder name there, a project-based name there, then it would have actually created that folder and built it within that folder that I had named it. Yes, I do want to create it in this current folder. We'll take the default name, we'll take the default description, the author. We're going to use the runtime and compiler for detailed explanations on that. You can look that up on the official Vue-CLI. But I always install the compiler. If I'm doing a real lean version, I may start looking at removing the compiler. But if you come from the world of Angular and React and Bootstrap and all those, where the file size of the bundles is in the megabytes, this one is a difference of 6K. So it's hardly worth even talking about. But I'm going to use the standard configuration, which is the runtime and compiler included. We're going to install the Vue router. I typically would install ESLint, but I'm not going to do it on a tutorial because I don't want anything blocking the compiling. We're not going to do any testing, and we're not going to do any end-to-end testing, either unit testing or end-to-end testing. And that's it. So now we've got our instructions for the npm install and npm run dev to go ahead and start the project. But what I want to show you real quick is under the package.json file is our two core files are actually quite a bit out of date. So I want to just go ahead, because you won't break anything in the Webpack compiling system by updating the core files, then you might as well just go ahead and update them. And because npm update is a little tricky, most of the time I just do an npm install vue --save. And you'll see that went from 2.3.3 to 2.4.2. And then I'm going to do npm install Vue router save. And that will update our router to our 2.7.0. Okay, so at least the core components now that are our building blocks, not the files that are used to build it, are at their latest versions. And I did want to show you that because I do recommend going ahead and updating the dependencies. Not necessarily the dev dependencies, because if you update any of your dev dependencies just indiscriminately, then you're going to end up with incompatibilities, deprecated packages, problems that, well, have not been looked at as of yet because the system hasn't been examined to make sure that it, in fact, will play nicely together. And most of the time, if you just update those, it probably won't play nicely together. So leave the rest of the dev dependencies alone and just update the dependencies. All right. So now we've got the latest Vue router installed, and we've got the scaffolding done with our package.json file. Now, in my project, I can do show npm scripts. If you're using WebStorm, you can do the same thing. You can also run the npm install from a pop-up if you would like, or you can type it out if you're using a command line. So in the terminal, you can simply put npm install. And that's going to now install everything that's in our package.json file. All right. This is one of those functions that allows us, prevents us from having to type the npm run dev and using Control-C to stop if you're using Windows. The command interface that's given to us by WebStorm is nice in the fashion that we'll go ahead and start this real quick. So now we're starting the program. It's in its default mode, and of course it came up on a different screen, so I'm going to bring it up over here, and we're going to bring it right there on that right side. It didn't like that. Let's try that again. There we go. So we've got that started, and we're going to inspect. You obviously need the inspector on so that so it doesn't cache the files as you're working on them. And then we will go ahead and open the Vue DevTools. If you don't have the DevTools installed, you should go install them. They're now available for both Chrome and Firefox. Okay, so to get back to the point, that this allows us to both start and stop and restart our Vue application without having to deal with the command line or terminal. So at this point in time, let's just go over our files real quick. We have our index, which is where we're going to, let's go ahead and turn that off. There we go. Our index file where we're going to install, take a little room here, the Material Design Lite information, We've got the static file, which currently has nothing, but if you wanted to add favicons or other files that you wanted to just statically move over into the build file, this is where you'd add them. You've got your source, which includes the asset, the logo, this. Any other assets you wanted in there obviously would go in that particular folder. You've got your components, which is the hello component, and it's actually this text right up under here. We've got our router, which is routing the hello component into our main application. We've got the app.vue, which is actually the parent app of everything so far. It's actually hosting the image within its first div. Here's app and here's our image, and then it hosts the router. So everything that changes in the router actually comes right after this image in this block right here. All right. And then we've got the main file, which is our primary starting file. If we were to watch the index, when it's built, Webpack actually inserts our script right down here at the bottom just for the body tag for our bundle file. So if we were to actually build this, we'll do that real quick because we can actually build and run the dev server at the same time. We can't run two dev servers, but we can build and run the dev server. So we'll run the build, and what we end up with is this distribution folder with the static files, like I was telling you. If there are any static files that you wanted to put in your source file, this is where they would show up. And we end up with the CSS file and the JavaScript that Webpack builds, plus our index file. Now it's minified and uglified and whatever else-ified that they have done to it to make it as small as possible. But you notice that here is your end script tag that they're bringing in all their JS with that isn't shown in our original HTML file. Now, I certainly recommend that we update the HTML file a little bit because it's a little too vanilla. Now, I'm going to use Emmet to do so, but that's the first thing I'm going to do is do an HTML5 Emmet. And that way, I get my viewport and I get my XUA compatible meta tags in there. And if nothing else, the view tag is obviously very important. So we lose our document title, which was basically the name of our project, and we lose our div tag that has the ID of app that we have to have because obviously Vue.js requires that to continue to run. So that will basically complete the install. Let's go ahead and start looking at bringing in Material Design Lite. Okay, so from here, let's go ahead and take our index file. I'm going to bring in Material Design Lite so we can see it. This is, so you can see it here. It's just getMDL.io. I'm going to assume you already know a little bit about Material Design Lite if you're looking at this. But, you know, you can read upon it in the documents and stuff online. It's a material design framework that's been around for an awful long time. Anyway, so we go to the getting started, and because we're creating a component, we're not going to worry too much about how we import the information, the CSS files and the JS file that support the Material Design Lite. If we were doing a large build and this wasn't, you know, building an outside component that goes into something else, I'd probably worry a little bit more about bringing everything in to the build process to make sure that we were getting the most optimized system, especially if I was doing something like a PWA or something in that nature. But let's go ahead and bring in our style sheets. And that's going to bring in the icons and the primary style sheets. Let me go ahead and move this, give us a little bit more room. And we can close that on down. We can bring that on down. Okay. And then let's bring in our JS file to support that they use to support the dynamic aspects of the Material Design Lite. All right. So we've gotten that information off the website just by going straight to the Getting Started tab and doing the hosting. Obviously, we can go to the NPM and bring in Material Design Lite through the NPM and bundle it as we would most other NPM modules. But in this particular case, like I said, since we're just building a component, we're not going to pay a lot of attention onto optimizing how we put this into our system. Okay, so now our HTML, our index.html file is set up. We've got our app div, we've got the two style sheets, and the JavaScript that we need to make sure that the Material Design Lite CSS framework functions properly. Okay, so we can go ahead and just save that, hit Control S, and then we're going to shut down the index file. And let's go ahead and bring all this out. And we can go ahead and shut down our Material Design Lite, or we'll just tab out of it and give us as much room as we can here to work. It's awfully difficult. As you can see, our Material Design Lite has already changed the fonts in our Vue.js template core system. But anyway, okay, so the next step is that we need to go ahead and clean out our hello.vue. So we're going to go ahead and just wipe all this stuff out, because this is going to be our main parent component for our login component. Anyway, let's bring that in. So we're going to do a new file in the component directory, and we're going to call it login component.vue. Now I have a quick live snippet that I use. I can just hit big V little U and hit tab, and it kind of scaffolds out my component template. Obviously, you can just pause the video and copy this, type it in how you want to, or get it from the GitHub repository that I will put up. It's currently using the wrong indentions, because I think when it was set up, it was using 4-space indentions, and ESLint wants 2-space indentions. So I just hit Control-Alt-L on my keyboard, and that reformats my code so that it follows whatever I've set it up to follow, which is the 2-space indentation system. Okay, so now that we have our template set up for our login component, let's go ahead and change the name of it to login component. And that'll ensure that when I bring it into the hello parent via here, now I can do, let's see, I can bring that in. That's one of the nice things about WebStorm and PHP Storm is it already knows that what I want to do with it. I've created the component. It knows it exists, and I don't have to type my import and then bring my import in and then be able to use it. As you can see, it's already available to me in this hello.vue component, even though I haven't imported it. So for speed and things of that nature, the what's called IntelliSense, which is this box that comes up and gives you hints on your next move, is very, very nice in WebStorm. So I can just select login component, and you're going to watch when I hit that, it automatically brings in my import right there. And it brought in the components additional right there, so that I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to, while I remember those functions, when you're first starting out, a lot of times you don't. You know, you've got to remember the import from statement. You've got to remember to put the components colon and then add the components to your Vue component. You know, when you're adding components upon on top of it, within it. So that's just kind of a nice little trick I wanted to show you that ViewStorm allows you to do. So now we've got our login component. Even though there's nothing in it, we've got it. It's in our Hello View. It is sitting down here below our image file. Not hit Control Save. I just wanted to refresh. But there's nothing inside it, so obviously we're not seeing anything. Now, in our app.view, we want to go ahead and get rid of the image of the Vue logo image. No need to have that. So we went to app.view, and I just eliminated it. We're gonna go ahead and leave our router in. There's no real reason to get rid of it at this point in time. I am going to go ahead, however, and eliminate all these all the styles for the app, because we don't want those interfering with the end styling. I do want to, however, add a little bit back because I want to put in some padding at the top. And I just put in 70 pixels. But just to get it off the top, so that we're working in this area and not crammed up to the top. So I'm just adding some padding to the top of the outside area. You notice we don't want to add that within the component because we want the component to be basically, you know, zero margin, zero padding. So if we bring it into another program, it doesn't have any of its own opinions. All right, so we've got our app.view cleaned up and basically as ready as it needs to be. We can close that on down. Our main.js file, we don't need to bring anything into our main.js. We're just using a component. If anybody's ever wondering what the production tip equals false is, if you're in your right-hand side corner, and I'll change this real quick, it tells you that you're running the view in the development mode. So that's all that does right there, that production tip. By turning it off, it turns off the information that says, you know, you're running your code in production mode and it's not optimized for delivery. And of course, that's only because we're running it in the dev. If we compile that as we did in the build, then the build is stripped of all the unnecessary additional pieces and parts, and this production tip, even if you left it to true, would disappear in the build, not in the dev tools. So we don't need anything else here. We've got our hello view, and we've got our logins component, which is being brought into the hello.view component. So that's all done. The only thing we need to do now is go ahead and start building our login component. Okay, so I guess we'll just, I'm just going to push through this. This is going to be a long one because this is really a big project. We're going to start with the MDL grid. So if you're not familiar with the grid system, you can find it under the Material Design Lite layout grid. And it works similar to Bootstrap, but it is a little different. The offsets are a little different. And the way that we're going to run the offsets is we're going to do a spacer, then our grid component, not our grid component, but our component, and then another spacer. And these spacers are going to auto width so that our component's always in the center. And then we're going to hard set our center component. So let's go ahead and create the kind of the scaffolding. So we got spacer, our component, and then spacer. So we've got a div, and its class is going to be, so we've got MDL layout spacer, right? Yes. Okay, so that gets us our spacer, and then we can, I hit Control D to copy the line. So basically I've got 3 lines. This one's not going to be a spacer. This is going to be the card. So if you know anything about material design, almost everything's based on a card. I like the card design for the login, as you've seen what it already looks like because we've shown you what we're going to develop. So we're gonna develop the card as a login component, and we need to obviously set some things about it. We want to set this shadow design on the back side of our card here. And as you can see, they do theirs at 2 pixels. So we're going to do MDL shadow. $2DP. I'm outside of that darn class. There we go. Sorry about that. Save. And we should have a card, there we go, in the middle here. Now, here's our spacer on the left side. Here's our spacer on the right side. And here's our big blank card. All right. Now, one of the problems is in sizing, I really don't want this card to change, right? I've got my set login size. It doesn't need to change. It can fit on the smallest of screens. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a layout width so that it fits on all screens, basically 320 pixels wide. We can do that by looking at our phone emulator in Chrome and just picking the smallest one. So we've got this 320 pixel wide phone, which is the smallest one they offer, and we would still fit if we did a 320, basically a 320 pixel wide unit with a tiny bit of spacing on the other side, on either side. But, you know, I mean, most of our phones are running into that, you know, mid-range, vertical, right there. And of course, you know, everything else is large enough to hold certainly any login component, card component that pops up. So let's go ahead and bring that back over and get ourselves some room here. Get rid of our phone emulator up here on the top right so it gives us a little bit more room again. And I'm going to go ahead and just scope a style in real quick, and we'll bring it in for the card. I'm going to go ahead and give us a little bit more. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to add a class just to control the size of my login card size. There we go. Something I know will never get crossed with somebody else's. All right. And then we're going to do a max width of 320 pixels. And we'll just do height as auto. All right. And as you can see, I mean, it didn't change much. It was just kind of already there. Now, we've got our card. So we've got our basic component sitting in our Hello View component. I want to make sure that you guys do this. When you bring this, when you first start up Vue, this is your template. And I cleaned out the template and I cleaned out anything else that was sitting around. I added the login component. I don't know if I told you to clean the style sheet. We don't want any styles in the sheet. I don't think it would ever affect anything because it wouldn't cross with the MDL style. But if this is not empty on yours, just empty it, just like it is sitting right there. Now bounce back to me. Okay, so we're sitting with the login all scaffolded out. Now we just need to add what's inside our card. So we're going to have the title. Let's go up to the top here. This top section is called their title section. Then you have the supporting text section, and then you have their actions section. So we need 3 sections within our component div to cover that. So we've got the div with the class of MDL card title. Then you're going to need div class MDL card supporting text. I kind of want to just keep these like that. That way you can kind of see how the, and then we have a div class MDL card actions. You'll kind of notice a commonality here is within a component they use the double underscore for pieces and parts of that component. And then everything else is hyphenated. So we've got the MDL card, then we've got MDL card underscore underscore title, MDL card underscore underscore supporting text, and then, so on. That gets us our 3 points, and we'll go ahead and save that. Not save, goodness gracious. Save that. Make sure everything's up to date. Now, in our title, we're going to want a color, because right now everything's blank. There's no borders or anything. We actually do have a title, we do have supporting text, we do have an action section, but we don't have any color separation or any separating systems to show exactly what that is. So we've got MDL color dash primary. It's material design. So you've got a primary color and a secondary color. That's how it associates the color system. So if I save that, that's my primary color of indigo. And we control that. I need to jump back. I kind of forgot that when I put that in. In our index file, when we bring in our CSS file for Material Design Lite, we control the colors right here. If you look at Material Design, we can change those where it says indigo-pink. We can actually change those to whatever colors we want. They've already got it set up, and when I say whatever colors we want, it's got to be within the Material Design system. I just set it up as the default, which was indigo and pink, but you can do red and blue. You can do whatever other colors you want to just by changing this right here. And one of the problems with MDL is this is the only way to bring in the CSS and change the colors. If you bring the CSS through Node or through an import, then you can't change the colors. So it's one of the reasons we do bring the CSS through the script, through the link tags and the script tags in the index file, is because you can't change the colors unless you bring the CSS portion of this through a link tag in the index file. So just FYI, that's where our colors come from. That's how you can change the colors for the primary and secondary. You can always change the colors. You can always change the colors at the component level by using their color tag. But if you want that primary, secondary material design setup, this is where you change the colors right here. So back to where we were. Let me close all that down. So if I'm doing the primary, that's why this showed up as indigo. And any buttons I put on would show up as pink because that's how material design is set. Okay, so we've got our title, we've got our supporting text, and that's where we're going to put our form fields. And then we've got our action, and that's where we're going to put our login buttons. So we want to get rid of, put a space here and a space here just so I can see a little bit. And here's what we're working with right there. So put a space there. Okay, so we've got our title. Now let's go ahead and just give our, because we know it's going to be login, so we can just do an H2 or something. Class MDL card. Yeah, everything's the same way. Title, text. All right, we'll just call that login. All right, now we got our login, except that I want that to be white. So we're going to do MDL, I think it's color, yeah, and text. And that this would be how you would change the text and the backgrounds using MDL. As you can see, you've got MDL color text, you've got MDL color, and then that whatever you put there, you know, that could be brown. You know, it's really is that simple. But because we want that template functionality, uh, of the fab and the titles and the borders and everything else to be in sync with the color system, then we're just going to use primary and secondaries. Okay, so that gets us our title block and our login. So now we just need to add some forms real quick. It's going to work kind of like Bootstrap. They're going to have their own kind of wrapper around the inputs. So we're going to do a div, we're going to do a class, we're going to do MDL text field. And you need the MDL JS text field. And this is straight off their instructions, so there's nothing special I'm doing for any of this. We're going to want 2 of those because we're going to want a username and password. So that did not duplicate the way I wanted it to. That was Control D, by the way. Okay, so we have 2 text fields. That shouldn't really change anything. I have got to stop doing that. Right here. There we go. All right, so we want an input. Obviously, it's going to be type email. That's all I'm going to do right now. Input type password. All right. I don't think these things are updating. There we go. Okay, so our class on our input is, we just keep following the same pattern. So we've got MDL text field underscore underscore input. Right? So you just keep following that kind of MDL, whatever the component is, and then you start doing the underscore underscore for the pieces and parts of the component. So we're going to do the same thing here. So we got class, MDL, text field, underscore underscore input. All right. So now we've got our 2 inputs. We need labels for those inputs, obviously. Label. We're going to do it for. We're going to do for our email. Now, if you don't know, when you do a name email and an ID email, a lot of people only do the ID because the name is for form sharing across post and get and all that. ID is more associated with JavaScript and how to get the reference to that item. But if you use your name email and use the name password, then most browsers automatically know that it's an email and it's a password, and they'll autofill that for you for your customers, which is convenient and nice. Just one of those small added benefits. So when you're doing email, password, first name, last name, address to, city, state, zip, don't make up weird names for them. Just call them what they are. Email, password, first name, last name, et cetera, or you just call it first and last. There's articles on the web about how to stay within the standardization of that, so that Chrome and Firefox and Safari and all those guys know how to just autofill that based on previous inputs, and it works everything from credit cards to addresses to email and passwords to you name it. So when you start using, my email and my password as variables, then the browsers don't know what those are, and unfortunately that ends up being a crippling feature on your customers. So just a side note. Okay, so we did our label for email. The class is obviously class is going to be MDL, and then you've got text field underscore label. Okay, and then of course giving the label email address. There we go. Now you've got that email address in, and one of the things about, because it's a JavaScript enabled system, is we kind of just have to refresh to get some of the functionality out of everything. Okay, and then of course we need to add JavaScript into our text field and tell it what we want to do. So in our div wrappers, if I didn't already do that, and I should have, we've got that. We want to tell it that we want in our, I should have already done that because I duplicated it, but we want the floating labels, so we need to add those. MDL text field floating label. There we go. I'll just copy that down to the other wrapper. Okay, so we've got two wrappers here. We've got the email wrapper, and then we've got the password wrapper. So we're just going to do class label password. All right, let's give ourselves some room here. We don't need all that stuff on the left, so you can see. There we go. And then, of course, our input needs a name of password to help the browsers and an ID of password for JavaScript and label functions. Then we're going to, now, like I said, that doesn't just automatically refresh, so we've got to just refresh that. And now that we've got the text field floating labels, we get the nice Material Design functionality that allows those labels to float. Let's do our checkbox. The checkbox works a little different. It's wrapped in a label function because the label comes, well, after the component. So you've got your input type of checkbox. Let's see, MDL checkbox. And the checkbox just works a little bit differently than a number of the other ones. So, you know, because we add the label afterwards. So we've got remember me set up kind of like that. Now in our label, we want the label and the checkbox to be class MDL checkbox. And we want it to do all of its JavaScript stuff. And we like the ripple effect. MDL.js.ripple effect. I'll show you what that is here in just a second here. Okay, so we do that. We can refresh that. So now we get that little MDL style checkbox. And then when we click on it, that's the ripple effect that you see. I haven't let go of my mouse yet. Now when I let go, you get the check and the uncheck. That's the ripple effect. And it's pretty standard in Material Design. You can remove it if there was ever any type of JavaScript interactionality, functionality problems with it. So now all we need is our buttons in our action. So in our action, we're looking at our card. I noticed that there's this MDL card border. So we'll go ahead and grab it and put it in. I've just kind of always done it. I've never really thought about it. Okay. It gives us the horizontal line within our border. There we go. So it gives us our separator within the action bar. So we added the MDL card border so that we have the separator, and now we can do a button. Class is MDL button. MDL JS button to allow the ripple effect that we're going to add. We're going to do MDL raised, which gives it color. Otherwise, it would be a gray button, and it would get color as you push it. But we want it to have that color right off the bat, so that it has that it creates focus. MDL JS ripple, which we've already talked about. And then the MDL button accent. It's a lot of stuff, but it, you know, gives you a lot of things. Sign in. I'm going to go ahead and break our set right here so we can see what's going on. There we go. All right. Now, when I did the MDL button, the MDL raised, I misdid it. So it should be MDL dash button dash dash raised. And that gives us our raised look and MDL button accent. That accent right there doesn't have another dash. This brings it to the accent color. There we go. So my errors allowed you to clearly see how all of that works. Silly typos. So now we've got the whole thing scaffolded out. Looks good. That's how we want it to basically look. We've got our button. Of course, it's not doing anything. We still need to add a form in there so that we can tell the form what to do. But we've basically got all of our scaffolding done. And it looks pretty good. So let's move on. Now we'll give it some functionality in storing with vModel and such, the email and password, and then start working on those. So, okay, so now let's go ahead and put in our form. We're going to go ahead and start wrapping this up and giving it some functionality. We're going to put our form outside of everything because we want it to encompass the button, the remember me. We want it to encompass the two inputs. So since the sign-in button is obviously in the action section at the last part of the component, it seems pretty obvious that for the form, we're probably just going to want to wrap the whole card. So, or just inside the card. So I'm just going to bring it out. There's my spacer. So I'm going to just kind of bring this where we've got our first indentation and put a form section here. So we'll do the @submit .prevent because we don't want it to actually refresh the page. Equals, do log me in. And of course, we don't have the method yet, so it's showing me a little error. Now we're just going to want to move the end tag just before that form ends inside the class. So, just to give us a little bit, I know the form kind of gives us an indicator, but I'm just going to go ahead and add a comment here that says end card or MDL card. Just as I get nested into divs, you kind of have to have these endpoints so that you can see where your divs, even in a good IDE that gives you your vertical lines, sometimes your divs get a little bit long. You know, this one's a good little example of it. If you click on here, we can see that's the end div, but it's sometimes nice just to add a end card supporting text, so that you can kind of see, and the Webpack system in the Vue compilation system will strip all those out anyway, so they don't affect the size of your end product. When it builds the system, it strips out all comments. You can actually, I think they just added the ability to leave some comments in, and the importance of that is there are certain browsers that read comments as part of how they'll operate on code. So you can use a comment system that doesn't affect the HTML visually, but the browser can read it and figure out some aspect or something that it needs to do. Anyway, to get back to the point, so we've got our form in. We've added log me in, so right off the bat, so we don't have that error, we'll just do methods. Woo! So we've got the log me in method. All right. And that covers our form. Now we get a little text validation right out of the box. Now, like I said, you're going to see this happen as you build this. You just kind of have to refresh it because it's JavaScript and how it functions. It doesn't. It's not tied into our hot swap system. So we get some basic functionality out of the validators. So if I start typing something, as you've seen, I get that basic validation, but I don't get any message. So we're going to have to add a message under there so that we let the customer know, besides just the red indicator. And we're going to have to deal with each one of those in a real-time motion in this particular case, because we can't do required. And let me show you what happens. So if I take my password and I put in the standard required attribute that says, hey, your password's required, obviously, and I refresh that, you notice that my password just automatically ends up being invalid. Well, I don't want to start the system off invalid. I don't want to start the form off invalid, and it affects the entire system. So I can't use email and password required in the document, because then they both start off in the red. Now, there's a big argument going on as to whether that should be that way or it shouldn't be that way, and I don't think it should. I think it should start off blank, untouched, undirty, as in programmer words, and it should start off just like that. And as we interact with the component, then it tells us whether it is or is not functioning properly. So this is the little gotcha, what I call a bug, they may not, that I don't like about Material Design, so we have to kind of work around it. We know that the password's required. We know that the email's required. But as of right now, there is no, if I hit sign in, that's going to the log me in component. If I put an alert right here, there's nothing stopping it. So if I just do an alert, just like that, and I refresh, I have no validation stoppers. So I don't have any way to pre-validate my inputs with even just a, hey, you need something there. So that's kind of, I'm a little disappointed in the way that they implemented that. So now we have to work around that. But let me go ahead and get rid of, well, I'll just go ahead and leave that there, because the sign-in can stay that way until we get ready to actually make sure it's functional. So the first thing we're going to want to do is on the email input is we're going to go ahead and want to add a more realistic error message than just red, right? So anyway, back to where we were. So we want to span, give it a class for the text error. So that's MDL text field dash dash, everything's dash or underscore error. So that ties that to the email input, and then we can just say, I guess the other one is like, what, please enter a valid email address. Okay, so if we refresh that now and we start to type something, we get the actual text under the box. All right, so we're going to want to do the same thing for the password. Span class MDL text field error. And it's going to be, well, let's go ahead and set that up. One of the things about the text field is we're going to want a pattern on it. So I'm going to just put, let's type text. Okay, so pattern. And if you're unfamiliar with pattern, pattern allows us to use regular expressions to prevent or enforce a type of input. So you can look up regular expressions. You can look up pattern. It's not MDL specific. It's actual HTML5. So look up the password input and pattern recognition, and we can control what is allowed inside that field. Whether you want, I've got to have a a small character, a capital character, an integer, and a special character, or you can't use this special character, or you can use this. All of that can be done with pattern. And the simplest pattern is simply to do a start and finish pattern for, let's say, 4,10. My IDE is helping out too much. There we go. And that will enforce a pattern of minimum of 4 or up to 10, but not greater than. So see, so once you've got 4, then the pattern allows for anything greater than 4. But as we get to 10, it goes back because we can't have more than 10. So that's your pattern system in HTML5. That has nothing to do with Material Design Lite. We use the exact same pattern system on the Bootstrap version of this. So that ties in with our error system, and we can put in something that says password length must be at least 4 and no more than 10 characters. Wow, that's a lot. But, okay, so let's see. That's not an underscore, that's a that. There we go. Okay, I don't want it to actually span more than 2 lines. I could move this down and fix that, so let's just see if we can pare this down to make more sense. We can just say I think that's proper. There we go. Now, wow. Not a lot of room, so you're going to have to be creative on what the length is going to be. Because I've got my min width already. See what I used previously. Huh, that's interesting. I wonder why that fits. Alright. That's what I used previously, so we'll just keep that the same. I think that's because I'm overlapping. Let's see. Ah. Why is my min width not working? So we have a my login card size min width. My login card size min width. Wow. Sorry about that. We'll have to go back and correct that, won't we? We'll do some special text editing to just let you know that that's wrong way back in the back. All right. So now that makes sense. Okay. So now it'll go off the screen and won't wrap on me, even if I don't have the room. Okay. That problem fixed. So now we've got the password system running, and we've got our pattern, which, like I said, you can go look up. It's HTML5. So we've got pattern matching, and we've got our error. We don't have a required, so we're going to have to handle that programmatically. But we do have real-time validation with the email address. And we have real-time validation with the password. And we've got real-time feedback on those. The Remember Me button is in Material at this point, and then, of course, we've got the Login button. So now we've got our validation, basic validation done, and we need to go ahead and V-model our inputs. So we're actually not going to V-model, because there's never going to be a case where we actually need to send information back to the inputs, except when we maybe look for a cookie or something. And in that particular case, we'll do it the old-fashioned way of bringing in the ref. And I'll show you that when we get to that point, because when we add that back from the cookie that we're going to pull in later, then we'll show how that's wrapped back to the inputs. We're not actually going to store the information of the inputs in a V-model variable, a two-way binding variable. So in our inputs, we're just going to use @input to bind that one way, do that one-way binding, or attach that event, and we're going to set that to check email validator. All right, and then we're going to do the same thing for our password. @input equals check password validator. All right, and obviously we're going to need two methods for those. So our methods, we're going to do check email validator, and check password validator. All right. Got rid of all of our errors. And what we want to do at this point in time is, since we can't check for a required without setting them off to be invalid, is we kind of need a way to go ahead and stop this action right here. And the best way that I know how to do that is just to disable the sign-in button. So we're going to need a data field for that, so that we can do a is enabled, is disabled. Strap a disabled to the button. So let's find our button here real quick. If we just do disabled, it kills our button. Nothing can happen. So we're obviously going to want to do a Boolean, and bind it. So let's give it to button, let's see, submit button disabled. So the easiest way to do that is to make sure, is you write something that is either true or it is either false. Is the submit button enabled? Yes or no. So we'll come down to our data, and we'll do a submit button disabled, and of course we're going to start it off as true. Might as well. If we make that false, then our button is enabled, as you can see. But because we know that these are going to be blank, unless we're bringing in the cookie to pre-fill them out, and we'll deal with that when it comes in, once it's created. We know that that is going to be disabled on startup. So now that we've got that, we've handled that bug, as I call it, of not being able to use the required attributes on the HTML5, thanks to the way that MDL, Material Design Lite, implemented their validators. So now we've got our validation. we need to make sure that in our validators, that if in fact they're valid, that we re-enable our login ability. So to do this, we're going to do two things. We're going to make sure that there's something inside the text box on both of them. We're also going to ensure that they meet validation. Now, to do that, we need to actually grab a reference to the input itself, because we're not going to be checking the validator on the form, and we're not going to let the form try to submit. So we need to give them a ref. And a ref is a way of Vue to grab the actual DOM element outside of its virtual DOM. So it gives it a reference to the real DOM element, not only what's in its virtual DOM. And if you don't know what that means, go see how, look up how Vue handles the DOM, and you'll understand that there's a middleman. There's what's called the virtual DOM. That concept, as far as I know, was first brought on by React, and it's one of the reasons that React ended up being so fast compared to everybody else until Vue came along and not only copied it, but made it a little bit better. So Vue ends up with even a little bit better of a virtual DOM. But the virtual DOM stands in between the DOM and the JavaScript interfacing with it, and that's what makes it so efficient. So we're going to do ref equals text email. And for our password, we'll do ref equals text password. All right. So now that we've got a reference on each one of those, we can call them by their reference. And we're going to check their validation. So let me go ahead and type this out real quick. We use the ref by the $, just like the store, just like the router. As you find out, anything that we need to access as a API, as it were, part of the functionality, interacts with the $. So we've got text email, and we're going to check its validity, which is an HTML5 component ready function. Check validity is not part of Vue. We're actually pulling the JavaScript ability out of the actual DOM. Then we're going to need to check not only its validity, but we want to check to make sure that it actually has an input, that it's not left blank. So if this refs text email, text password. So we're checking the validity of email. We also need to check the validity of password so that we can disable the button. So let me just finish this up, and I'll actually explain it instead of trying to do two things at one time and saying the wrong thing. Backwards. All right. Okay, so let me explain this now. So what we've got is we're checking the validity of the email, and as we type the email, we want to make sure that as its validity becomes true, that this will re-engage. Unless, of course, this is also invalid. So that's what all that was about. Now that's valid. We don't want that to actually engage unless this was valid too. So if we wipe that out and we put this, which makes that valid, we can now type the email address and we get our button. So you see what we're doing. What we're doing is we're actually allowing the validator on email to make sure it's valid as we're typing in, and then also checking to make sure that the password is passing validation at the same time before we enable that button to become true. Now, obviously, because we didn't do the second one, we didn't do it for password. If we went to password and made that valid, we're not getting the button coming true. So we need to copy that and put that in our password validator as well, and simply change our password and email to reflect the reverse direction. All right, so now we have completely functioning manual validators because of that darn bug that they had. So we can do that, which becomes valid, but because password's not valid, it's not going to pass. We can do that, but because email's not valid, it's not going to pass. But this passes, right? But goes away. That was our else. If it fails again, we don't want it to pass and then them change something and that leave the button up. And if that's passed and that's not passed, then our button disappears. Now we still have one more problem, and I'll figure that out here in a few minutes. And I haven't actually looked at this. Is that if our password is empty, we actually need to check and this .refs text password value equal to. There we go. Now let's see if that works. Got to refresh. E at E. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. So what we had is a problem that again is caused by that darn required. If we don't have that, making sure that the password is not empty, then it won't work. Now we need to do the exact same thing here to the email. So we just do and this .refs text email value is not equal to nothing. Okay, so now there's all of our validation. We now completely control the sign-in, and I believe that is all we need. E. By the way, that's a valid email address. All right, and if that goes away, we lose our sign-in all the way to 0. And of course, lose our sign-in there. Okay, so completely functions as we expected it to. There's no requirement for the remember me. So we now have a completely functional component that has all the validation it needs for its 2 inputs, and it's completely ready to go. So let's go ahead and now turn those into props so that we can set the password pattern from its parent, because obviously we're going to decouple the component. We don't want you going into the component and setting the component's password pattern. That needs to be its parent property. To decouple that. And we're going to need to set up our cookies so that we can check and see if the email already exists on the cookie and such, and set the one in the cookie. So we need that property. We want to add an error message down here that says, hey, I received bad credentials. So that's going to be part of the prop moving. And then we're going to need some functionality that when we hit that, this needs to change to is loading. So let's go ahead and take care of is loading. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Since it's not part of the parent. So when we hit this button, we need that to say is changed to is loading. So in our button, we're going to do, let's do our first if else. So we're going to do a span, and we're going to do v-if is loading. Then let's just do loading, right? And then we can use the span v-else. I did that. All right, v-else sign in. Perfect. All right, so now we've got our first v-if, v-else used. By the way, these have to be siblings. They have to be right on top of each other. There can be nothing in between if you use the v-if and the v-else. All right. So we need an is loading in our data, since it's completely local. So is loading. And of course, it should start off as false, because it won't be loading when you first bring up the page. And everything's working. So if we do in our log me in, and we change is this dot is loading to true, then if we do a hit sign in, well, that came in after our alert box came up, but it's functional. Okay, so anyway, before I get lost in thought here, I think we've got that. Let's see what we've got. Obviously, our is loading, because we're doing an instantaneous synchronous alert pop-up, that's not how it's actually going to function. Yeah, we're going to want the this dot submit button dot disabled equals true. We'd want it to do two things. You don't want somebody double clicking the button, so you've got that loading turning into gray. We'll just get rid of our alert button here. We don't need that anymore. The alert's synchronous. It's actually happening so fast that it's happening before asynchronous, because it's happening before my buttons go from the virtual DOM to the DOM. Anyway, so that gets us done on that. We've got our is loading, we've got our sign in, we've got our validation. Now we just need to create our props. So let's go ahead and grab some props and put them in. So we're going to want, for our props, we're going to want our password message for if they put in an invalid type. We're going to want the pattern, and we're going to want an error message in case their login fails. So let's go ahead and bring in those props real quick. And we're going to do it long form. If you do it short form, it would be you'd bring in basically an array of prop names, and they would be like that. So you do, password message would look like that. Get rid of all that. So that's a prop, and that's fine, except that we want some validation. We want to make sure that our password pattern is not blank. So to do that, we're going to want some default and validation in that. So we do that this way: password message, and we're going to do type is string, the actual class type. As you can see, it's got a capital. Required, and the password message is false. You don't, no reason to require it. And the default. This is nice because you can give your props default values. So password length must be 2. Well, we do 4 to 8 characters. Okay. Period. So that's our password message. Then we've got our password pattern. Goodness. Type again is string. Required is true. Default is, we did 4 and 10. So that's our password pattern that would end up being inside the password pattern HTML, and we're going to want to validate it. So we can use the validator function value, and the validator function is just that. It's just a function that checks to make sure that the value meets a certain criteria. In this case, we just want it to meet nothing. So return value not equal that. So that will return a true or false of whether that passes this validator. And my IDE doesn't recognize validator. I guess it needs an update. Let's see. So we got one more error message, because it's going to be from the outside world. Its type will be a string. It's required. I don't know. That's up to you whether the error message should be required. I certainly would do it. So yes, the error message is required. And the default. Well, if we've got a default, then no, it's not required. There you go. That makes sense. So if we have a default, there's no need to require it. And what do we put as the default for our error message? Nothing in either one. It needs a default. Just sign in failed. Check credentials. There we go. Okay, so let's see. We've got yeah. So now we've got all of our properties, and of course we're getting errors over here because it's saying that our hello component is missing properties. So let's go ahead and bring that out, and we'll do password pattern, which is required. And it's nice because WebStorm reads right on into that. Pattern is required, and we'll do the dot 4, 10. Get a little bit tired. All right, and then we'll do password message equals, and we'll just copy that because copy that right there. There we go. And then we've got the error message. Copy that. All right. And we're good. We're back to where it should be. Now we just got to tie those. We've got to tie those items back in to our component. So now we've got the props. We need to go ahead and do things like Here's our passwords where we're starting with our prop. So scroll to the right here. Where's our pattern? Here's our pattern. Let's go ahead and just bind that with the quick binder, and we'll bring that in as password pattern. There we go. So that's bound, and our password pattern is still going to work. We needed our password message, so we can just mustache that to password message. All right. Make sure we had that right. Password message, not massage. There we go. And then we've got an error that we need to actually be able to show, right? So we'll bring that right down below the button, but it'll end up on the right-hand side because of the way that our div is here. We're going to keep it inside the card actions, so it'll kind of be on that right-hand side. We'll do a span v if error message. And of course, error message is going to have text, but if you know anything about truthy and falsy results, you'll know that an empty string is false, and anything other than an empty string is true, or truthy, actually. So that will end up being true if, in fact, we set the error message inside the pattern. And that's why there's no message inside the pattern. Okay, so color text equals, we'll do red dash 500. There we go. So as you can see, for our color, again, it's MDL color text dash whatever color you want, or MDL color dash whatever color you want. And we're using that Material Design red dash 500, red dash 400, etc. So we got that, and then we're going to mustache in our error message. All right. So let's see, that should all work. We want there not to be a default here, that's for sure, because we don't want a default with showing that there is an error message. And in our hello component, we actually don't want that to be a static. It's going to have to come back from some data type. So we'll call it equals credential fail. And we'll bind it to a data of credential fail. If I spelled it right. Is that right? Good. We've got everything working again. Okay, so now we've got everything sending down. I told you this was going to be a long one. We've got pattern password. We've got pattern message. We've got our error message. Our error message is set to nothing. Obviously, when we do our login and we dispatch everything, then it's going to set whether that failed or not. So now we've got everything bound together. We've got our props in. We've got our error message. The only thing we need to do now is that if the hello view actually sets the error message, then we need to make sure that the login component catches that. Okay, so we'll do that with a watch. First one ever. So we're going to do a watch for that to change, for our error message to change. So we've got message here, and really this, I do my props, I kind of like the name to be at the very top no matter what. So let's go ahead and just do that, move that around. There we go. And our data would be next. And after data, then we do watch. So now we can do a watch. If you don't know what a watch is, you can go look it up under computed properties and watchers. A watch is something that literally watches the adds event listeners to actually watch a variable all the time. It's an expensive item, so use them sparingly. We're going to set the error message, or we're going to watch the error message, and we're going to want to say if error message, this dot error message is not equal to nothing. So if they set it to nothing, we don't want, we don't want to set off any changes. This dot is loading equals false. They're going to make sure that it can be resubmitted. And this dot submit button disabled equals false. Now we're watching the error message, and when it comes back with something in it, we know that it failed credentials, and we can change our variables accordingly. In this case, our is loading will go back to sign in, and submit button disabled will become re-enabled again. So at that point that we've got everything scaffolded out, let's go ahead and do our log me in method, which is the form. Goodness, it's hard to find anything. There it is, the form. So we've got log me in method, which is when we submit our button. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and grab the variables directly from our inputs from the DOM. This dot refs, because we didn't set up vmodal. We didn't set up two-way binding on our values, and one of the reasons is if we can avoid prop mutation problems, because if we mutate a prop in a child component from the parent, we get errors and warnings because the parent can override our prop at any given time. So unless we need two-way binding that the parent has a prop interface with, I don't normally use it. This is just a easier way of and cleaner way of doing a single way binding when I don't need it to be real time. I can just grab it when I need it. So we'll do this .refs .text email .value, and hey, let's go ahead and trim that just to make sure there's nothing extra on the no extra white spaces. This .refs .text password wood password .value .trim. All right, so now we have the two variables. We have the two inputs from the email address and password. And let's go ahead and emit our function. We'll do this .emit. We're emitting a function. We're going to name the function, let's see what I named it before. It's login credentials. All right. It's going to carry a payload, obviously, of a POJO, which is a plain old JavaScript object. And it's going to be email, which will be the local email variable right here, and password, which is going to be the local password character right here. All right. So now we've got we're signing our local variables and we're passing them on. When we get to adding our cookie, we'll use these variables a couple more times. That's the reason I didn't just insert them directly right on into the emit function and added that extra step of adding them to the local variables. Okay, and then of course we're going to want to change our button. So this dot is loading equals true. This dot, yep, that's the one I want. Whoops. Dot submit button disabled is true. All right. So now we're going to admit the characters up. We just need to grab them. So let's go to our hello. We shall create a new method. Yeah, well, we're going to need to anyway. So we'll just open that up. We need to capture the event. So which is the shortcut for on, and we're going to do, what did we call it? We called it login credentials right there. At login credentials event, we're going to call the login attempt function, which we need to put in login attempt. It will carry a payload. We'll just call it credentials. There we go. And now we got a login attempt. Let's do a set timeout. And we're going to use a little ES6 here. The reason that I'm using ES6 is because it allows for binding. So in ES6, when I do a set timeout, the binding has to go up. There's two ways to get around. I'll show that in just a second here. So we'll set that to, I don't know, 2 seconds. We'll do a 2-second round robin. That's 2,000 milliseconds or 2 seconds for the round robin. We need to set our credential fail because we're just going to emulate the fact that it was incorrect. So this dot credential fail equals bad email or password. There we go. You can do this long form. If you do this long form, which is function like that, that's perfectly fine. But this now no longer references what you think it does. It actually references the callback function. So you would then need to either set this out here, so you can do like self. You'll see this quite a bit. So you can do let self equal this, and then this ends up being self, right? So you'll see that a lot, yeah, where they tie this component, which is this component, this export default component, the login component, to an extra variable, so that they can reference it inside a secondary component. So an easier way to do that is to use the ES6 method and arrow function, and it does your automatically binding, and it really kind of does this. Hold on just a second. So we'll do function, get rid of our arrow. It does something like this, and I think it's bind this. So basically it does that for us. So you can do that, as well as doing the outside credentials. So this bind this just makes sure that anytime you call this inside this timeout, it doesn't actually bind it to this. It binds it to the component outside of it, which is this. Okay, so I'm going to go back to using an ES6 function. They're useful. They're shorthand, and might as well start learning them, right? Good. All right. So that's our shorthand. And at this point in time, I guess we'll just do a console credentials.email. And I think I've done it here. Let's see, I'm going to do copy and paste those real quick. I'm just going to kick those out so that we know that we did, in fact, receive as a payload the email and password. Okay, so this should function. Let's see how many errors I tossed into it. E at E. So we've got that, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And we kick that out, loading. Hey, it came back bad password. We can see that in our console that we passed the characters. They're coming from right here. We've got a bad email and password come back in. When it came back in through our method, through our watch, error message, right? So it's coming back into the watch and it equaled something. So our sign in turned back. Goodness, I think we actually may be done 2 hours later. So that's everything except the remember me function. That should, see if I sign in again. We need to, this is not part of the component. If you were to sign in a second time without clearing the credential message going back and forth, it has no way to check to see if the error message changed because the watch doesn't change. So you need to, before you actually submit the character, you need to make sure that the credential fail here equals nothing. And you could set that in the component. You probably should set that into the component. It would be something you wouldn't want your, the outside to have to couple to the component. So you could set it in your component right after the emit character, and set it to go back to 0. So now if we do this, E at E password, sign in, it'll come back. That'll come back normal. But when we hit it again, this needs to disappear, which it did, so that the watch can reset our functionality. And that's what's happening is the watch is resetting that to sign in and enabling it, and waiting for that bad email password to come through. Okay, so like I said, you may want to move this instead of being in the parent component to clear it. Well, no, you may not want to. I don't know. Well, it's up to you. It's up to you because you're going to have to clear it one way or the other. Either the parent clears it when they pass, but you don't want to leave that saying bad email or password when they try and sign in again. Okay, I think that's it. I think that covers everything. We've got our real-time validation. We disable any buttons that can be pushed until everything is valid, and I think we've quality engineered that enough so that there's no way around it. At least not without hacking. The only thing that we need now is the remember me function to work. Now, we've already done this in Bootstrap, and it doesn't change. It's exactly the same way we did the tutorial in Bootstrap. So in our login component, what we'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and give us a little more room because this is just going to be a quick cut and paste. I'm going to show you what it is. We'll go over it real quick, and that'll cover that. So, and that'll wrap that sucker up. So in our login component, we need a mounted function. So we'll do that right before our watch. I don't know, a watch is kind of a variables. I think we'll do a mounted function right after the watch. So mounted, add our comma for that errors. We'll do a function because the mounted function won't hold functions. It's actually a function. And let me copy and paste what I've got. So basically, when the console appears, it's going to check the cookies section and see if there's any cookies. And if there is a cookie, it's going to load it in and directly bring it right into our text email and text password, the actual referenced inputs. And again, this prevents us from having to worry about mutating props or anything like that. So we're using the actual references to the DOM to shove it right in because we don't really care about what's inside here. We don't want to hold those variables for any reason. We just want to grab them when we're ready for them, right? So And we just did it real quick, and I had done this previously, so it grabbed a previous email and a previous password just by adding this section to the cookies right in the login. Because what it does is it just grabs the cookie. It uses this really nice match regular expression that I found on the internet that extracts it really nicely, and it's really robust. Because there are some different ways that can be stored based on users, things of that nature, maybe browsers. So you can go back to the Bootstrap video to see an in detail explanation of what everything here is, or you can look up storing cookies. But this match pull is really nice as far as pulling the cookie out, and it's just document.cookie to work with your cookies. And then we add the console.login. We need a button here, which we'll get to here in a second, but let's go ahead and go to our method for logging in, because we have our big cookie section here for that. And we're going to just set that right here. And if you want to copy that, you're more than welcome to. As you can see, I'll move that over a little bit. That's the way we write cookies. Cookies need a key value. You've got the function right here. So you need a key value. You need an expires, and that date to be in a date time in UTC. And then you need to add the path at which the cookie goes. And any of these three, if they're missing, could cause the cookie not to function. So this is kind of how we change, how we set our current times, and then we're adding our email as a key value pair. We've got our expires to the time that we set to UTC string, and then we just shove the path in. And then we're consoling out the log that we set it there. So what we need for this to function is a remember me switch that's tied to the checkbox. And to do that, we'll just add it right here in our data. Whoops, I hit insert. So we need a remember me set to false. We want to initialize it that way. Remember. Goodness, my typing is bad today. All right, and we want to bind that to our checkbox. Where's our checkbox? Right here. Oops. Type checkbox, bind. Oh, yeah, okay, we didn't want to bind it one way. We want to v-model it. Our only v-model in here. To remember me. Perfect. So that's our two-way binding, because we actually want that to go two ways. Let's see here. I'm going to refresh that. Now, I'm not going to set the remember me to remember automatically. So like if you set it once and you've got it remember me and you sign and come back, it's already there. I don't believe that that's good security practice, so I'm just going to leave it blank. You can do whatever you want. Maybe it's a personal use. Maybe it's a company website or something like that nature, and you want to be able to leave that there so your employees don't have to keep typing their own name in. I don't know. Whatever the reason, you have reasons to do whatever you do. I leave it so that every time you come back, it's going to not remember. So if we were to bring that in with out the remember me, that should eliminate, and it does, the cookie. And that's all done right there in the login. So, if the remember me is true, then it's going to do this section right here. And then else, it's going to delete it. So there's our delete. And we delete it by setting the expire date prior to the current date. And in this case, I set it to 19/7. And I kick out, hey, we just deleted the cookie. So that's it. I think we're completely done. I don't want to drag this on any longer than I have to. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope you like this. Please subscribe. I'll get more out. They won't be this long. This is my first attempt at something that was a little more complex than I expected, and I kept working on it to make it better. And in this particular case, I overextended. This should have been brought out into multiple parts. and I'll try and keep them smaller and more concise on the next run. But any questions, leave them in the comment section, and please subscribe. You can obviously hit like, dislike, whatever you think, and I will take any constructive criticism. Hey, this was a long one, and I got rambly and got tired, so off to the editing process so you guys can see it. Keep coding, have fun. Thanks, guys. Bye.